along the floor. Then I see you, you're walking across the campus. Cool professor studying romances. How am I supposed to pretend? I never want to.
For our stats project, we decided to ask the question, are people any nicer at Disneyland than they are every other day, wherever they are in their normal lives? There were a couple things we needed to set up before we started everything, and first we had to decide our two places that we would compare, because we eventually created a two proportion test. The first is obviously Disneyland. Most of it is downtown Disney, because the same people who are at Disneyland are at downtown Disney. So our first place is Disneyland, and then our second place was a place that people go all the time, that a lot of people spend a lot of time in. It's the mall. Essentially, we had our two places, and we designed this experiment around Dillon being in a wheelchair. We needed to see if people would push him or not. There were a few complications in that. First, we had to make him look realistic. So what we did was we casted his arm with this kind of plaster of Paris cloth, and we wrapped it around his arm, and then it dried, and it looked pretty realistic, and we signed it so that it looked cool. Then we also had this big boot that he wore, and so he looked pretty realistic. He broke his leg, that's why he's in the wheelchair, and he hurt his arm, that's why he can't push himself, that's why he needs other people to push him. So we're good with that. And then the other thing was to define when people were contacted to see if they said yes or no. Because if we were to say, or if Dillon was to say, hey, can you help me? And people are walking away, we could count that as a no, but they might not have heard him, so it doesn't really count. We decided to explain our contact very explicitly by having Dillon make an introductory statement. Almost every time he said, hey, excuse me, can you tell me where the blank store? And then they say, oh, it's right there, or they say, I don't know. So they say, yeah, it's over there, and then at that point, that's a contact. So then he asks if they can push him, and if they say yes or no, that's what we count. We don't count people that don't hear or ignore him or anything. It's just once he had already started a conversation with them, then we count it from there. So, hey, can you take me to the Lego store? Oh yeah, sure. And then they take him, that's a yes. That's one yes. And then no, or I'm late, and then that's a no. When we were at Disneyland, it was a lot more family oriented. We expected a lot more people to help out there, and then the whole happiest place on earth kind of thing, we wanted to test that theory. The whole idea of the wheelchair thing and the casting, that was my idea, because it's a very kind of universal form of helping somebody. You're gonna see someone in a wheelchair and want to help. So it's kind of like a good measure to measure someone. That's why it doesn't bring, race or age or sex into it. It's just straight like, hey, there's a person in a wheelchair, we should help them. Contacting people was a little tricky, because the idea was to get people going in the same direction. That way they're more likely to help, and if they're not going, it would get a lot more no's. And it might have been a little weird, me like pushing a wheelchair up to someone saying, excuse me, like popping out at them, and they might have got like startled by it. But a lot of the people at Disneyland, they're a lot more nicer. If they couldn't help me, they seemed sincere about their no's. One lady in particular was like, I asked her, I'm like, excuse me, can you help me? And she said, no, I'm sorry, I'm late for church. And I thought that was a funny excuse, because church is supposed to teach you about being good to one another, and it's built on morals, and this girl is not lending a hand to a crippled person. So that was pretty funny. The first couple ones we actually got were all yeses, so I thought, I'm like, okay, we're gonna have all yeses. But we eventually found some people that were kind of jerks.
that one lady who had to go to church, and there was one guy that I asked him if he knew where a place was. He's like, yeah, it's over this way. I'm like, can you take me? And he flat out said, no, I cannot take you. No excuse at all whatsoever. Even though I wasn't crippled, it hurt a little bit to have people like say no to your face, thinking that if you were actually crippled, they wouldn't help you. One of my favorite guys was at Disneyland. There was this guy who was like a hippie guy. He's like, hey dude, where do you need to go? I'm like, take me to La Brea. And he's like, yeah. So he starts pushing me, and then he hops on the back, and we start cruising down. And then like I just had this conversation with him, and like he was a really nice guy. And I didn't really get any people like that at the mall. Most of the yeses I got were like, oh sure, yeah, I would help you out. Oh yeah, maybe. But it was no like, they were glad to help me. They were forced to, kind of. But with that, the mall, I got a lot more no's, because I guess when you're at the mall, you're not necessarily with your family, you're just shopping by yourself. And excuse me, can you show me where PacSun is? It's over there. It's over there. Would you mind pushing me? It looks like you're going the same direction. No. But the yeses I got, they were reluctant yeses. They were like, they had to think about it, as to Disneyland, where they were like, oh, I should have lent a hand. But I think that was the biggest difference between the two places. I felt a more positive vibe at Disneyland. I seriously doubt that people go to Disneyland angry. Or even if they do go angry, they're not going to stay angry for very long.